Hey there, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, and welcome back to Law and Crime Now. A lot to get to in the show. First up, this big announcement that just came out. Let's go to Atlanta. Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard announced that arrest warrants have been issued in connection with the shooting of Rayshard Brooks. Garrett Rolfe, the officer who gunned down Brooks, he is now facing 11 counts, including felony murder and aggravated assault. Devin Brosnan, who is Rolfe's colleague, we learned will be charged as well. Now, according to the DA, this man, Brosnan, will testify against Rolfe and apparently plead guilty. But then we just learned before a minute ago that Don Samuel, who's apparently representing Mr. Brosnan, said that is not the case. So there's a lot to weave through here, and we're going to get more into it. We're also going to show you a portion of that press conference later on in the program. But right now, we want to shift our focus onto a major story that we've been covering. Let's go back to Idaho, because we're all still reeling from the revelation that the bodies of 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan were found buried in the backyard of their mother's husband, Chad Daybell. Now, Chad Daybell has been arrested and charged in connection with this. I want to go back to his initial court appearance where we learned more about the charges. And then after that, we're going to get into some new reactions to this development. Take a look.
The allegation is that the defendant, Chad Guy Daybell, on or between the 22nd day of September 2019 and the 9th day of June 2020 in the county of Fremont, state of Idaho, did willfully conceal and or aid and abet another to willfully conceal human remains, knowing that said human remains were about to be produced, used and or discovered as evidence in a felony proceeding, inquiry and or investigation authorized by law with the intent to prevent it from being so produced, used and or discovered. Count 2 is also the same charge: destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence, a felony. It's punishable by up to 5 years in the state penitentiary and or up to a $10,000 fine. It alleges that the defendant, Chad Guy Daybell, on or between the 8th day of September 2019 and the 9th day of June 2020 in the county of Fremont, state of Idaho, did willfully destroy, alter, and or conceal human remains, and or did aid and abet another to willfully destroy, alter, and or conceal human remains, knowing that said human remains were about to be produced, used, and or discovered as evidence in a felony proceeding. Inquiry and or investigation authorized by law with the intent to prevent it from being so produced, used, and or discovered. Mr. Daybell, do you understand the allegations on both counts that have been brought against you?
I do.
Mr. Daybell, do you also understand the maximum penalties on each of those counts?
Yes.
Mr. Daybell, do you understand that those maximum penalties could run consecutively, one after the other, or they could run concurrently? Do you understand that?
Yes.
Now, he's pled not guilty to the charges. He's in jail on a $1 million bond. Lori Vallow on child desertion charges. She's in jail on a $1 million bond. Their preliminary hearings are set for July. But again, I talked about the new reactions. Melanie Gibb, that's a name that should sound very familiar. We talked about her on the program. She was the purported best friend of Lori Vallow, knew Chad Daybell as well. And she wrote a 7-page letter after the discovery of these kids' remains. And she discussed how she was deceived, how Lori was seduced into Chad Daybell's spiritual religious world. I want to read you just a portion of this. She goes, "My heart is so broken because of what happened to all those who were murdered and those who I once called my friends." So there's really deep thoughts and reactions to what ultimately happened here. I want to bring in my panel. Joining me first up is retired homicide detective Dr. Kenneth Lang, criminal defense attorney Gabriela Teresa Gonzalez, and Law and Crime's own Terry Austin. It's great to have everybody here. Dr. Lang, I want to start with you. Investigators have said, be prepared that this is going to take a while for us to get answers onto what happened to JJ and Tylee. Why would that be the case?
So we have this period in which the bodies were missing, and then the bodies are found. And so the autopsy is going to be the first step in revealing what we need to look for in the cause and manner of the death. And with the bodies being buried in this grave on the property of Chad Daybell, there's most likely some decomposition. And so from that, we have this natural deterioration of the body, which actually rubs against the idea of being able to find the evidence that we need for determining the cause and manner of death. And then we see also that there's no charges for the actual murder itself. So it's apparent that the investigators are not quite sure at whose hands the children died at, if they even died at those hands. So the autopsy needs to make that ruling, and then once we have that, we can move forward with putting together a timeline of these events.
Just to follow up with you on that, if there was a clear and apparent reason for these kids' deaths, if it was a gunshot wound, that would be, perhaps we'd have heard something earlier. Does that, again, tell you anything? The fact that we haven't heard anything, does this suggest that it might not be so clear how they died? You know, I heard the reports perhaps there was poison that was used. It ties into the mysterious death surrounding this duo. We talked about possible burning. I mean, again, everything you've seen, the lack of information that we've gotten from law enforcement, does that tell you that the cause of death might be complicated?
The lack of information certainly indicates that they need to be very meticulous about examining these bodies. Again, we have the decomposition working against the investigators in determining that cause and manner of death. And toxicology reports do not come back pretty instantly. They usually take weeks, and they also need to be verified through the scientific standards that we use.
Yeah, okay, so it's not surprising. We are going to obviously keep following what's happening here, but we talk more about the reactions. Nate Eaton, who's from East Idaho News, he's been following this case without a lack of a better word, religiously. He actually conducted an interview with a woman named Suzanne Freeman. Now, Suzanne Freeman's an author that actually worked with Chad Daybell. She tried to cut ties with him, was a little weirded out by the publications and which way he was going. She revealed in an interview, she actually revealed an email that she had sent Chad back in 2017, 3 years ago, where she was trying to get her publishing rights back to her book, and she was concerned. Listen to this portion of her interview.
In there, and I don't have it memorized what I said, but something to the effect, if you continue to publish this material, there will be death and sorrow. I think that's what I said. So,
and this was written back in 2017, so 3 years ago.
Yep, it was 3 years ago. And I know I talked to friends about this, that there's something not right, what he's doing. I just don't want my name attached to this. I want out. And, but I don't remember emailing him what I mean, I was really quite straightforward in saying, I don't want my name attached to this. What you're doing is wrong. And people will die. That's what I said.
All right, Gigi, over to you. We're talking about some really wild things here. And of course, the question of mental defenses, mental health, insanity, these kinds of questions, how do you think they are going to play when we are talking about these really out there religious beliefs? Can they be a factor in either Lori or Chad's case?
Absolutely. You know, it's from the statements that we just heard and also the statements of Melanie Gibb. We could start putting together that Chad may have been the leader of some sort of religious cult, and that he might have been a really big factor in the causes of death and manipulating people into committing these acts. So for Lori, if the autopsy comes out that those children were indeed murdered, it's going to probably be to her benefit to raise the defense that this person, Chad, convinced me to do it because it was the way of our religion.
And Terry, we have preliminary hearings coming up in July. Do you think there's a way that Lori's defense team are going to say, well, listen, she's charged right now with a certain crime. She's not hit with murder yet. And the question could be, I never knew what happened to the kids. You can't prove that I knew they were in my husband's backyard. I mean, those kinds of defenses, is that something we should expect between now and July?
I do think that we will hear those types of defenses, Jesse. When we have the preliminary hearing, they're going to want to assert what their case is. They're going to want to try to get their client out. And I think Lori is going to be claiming that It's not on my property. I had no idea, how those bodies got there. And I think Chad is going to be claiming, listen, it's my property, but I didn't put it there. So I think we will hear those defenses asserted. Whether or not that prevails, I think the judge is clearly going to give us another date. And I think the case will move forward. And ultimately, while it takes time, I do think we're going to see these murder charges against both of them.
Doctor, you have to explain something to me because this property was initially searched. What happened here? Why? We've talked about the weather being an issue. Perhaps they couldn't discover something in the cold climates that warmed things up. But the fact that the property was searched, what led authorities back to Chad Daybell's property? Because we're still not entirely clear about this.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what would have led them back other than they felt that they had not checked everything or used all of the tools that were available to them. There's a number of means in which we can check for bodies when we're looking for them in a piece of property such as this. And usually we first go with visual detection, but we can move our way through looking by using probes or even radar if necessary. In those areas, but also they were missing since September. Spring came in, and one of the flags that we look for when we're looking for bodies in this area is new vegetation or a new type of vegetation that presents itself that is not necessarily part of the landscape. And so when that presents itself,
right,
sometimes
and quickly. We have about 20 seconds. I want to ask you real quick. September to now, what happens to a body in that time?
That depends on the region of the country. So in the southern portions of the southwest region, the hotter, the drier it is, the quicker a body will decompose. But up here in Idaho, if it's colder, it's going to preserve that body better. And I think that the autopsy is going to be quite revealing for us.
Well, I hope we do have all the evidence available and we can find out exactly what happened to these kids. Dr. Lang, thank you so much. When we come back, more stories for you. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody. We have an update for you in the case of Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., the suspected Golden State Killer who terrorized California in the 70s and 80s. We are hearing that he is in plea deal negotiations and may have a plea deal finalized soon. Now that's big because DeAngelo is facing a multitude of murders and rapes, and what we're hearing is it's possible he may plead guilty to 88 crimes in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. Now this is big because I want to, Gigi and Terry, you're back with me. Gigi, I want to start with you. Why would this be happening? Why would he agree to plead guilty? Does that just show how strong the prosecution's case is? Or do you have an older guy who really doesn't want to go through this trial and just wants to know what his fate is?
I think it's a little bit of both. The prosecution, while they do have a very strong case against the Golden State Killer, they also have to deal with the fact that a lot of their victims have passed away. There's a lot of, weaknesses that the state's going to have. And also, the defense isn't going to want to drag out this trial any longer than it has to be. Versus pleading guilty and accepting responsibility for these charges, he's going to take the death penalty off the table. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, but at least he doesn't have to worry about the fact that he might be getting sent to death row.
Terry, we're looking at a hearing that's scheduled for June and then a sentencing possibly in August. I've been hearing that there will be hundreds of people that would attend this, victims, family members of victims, huge, obviously, news presence. There are restrictions here in terms of COVID-19 about where they could actually house everybody, because it's not every day you have this kind of case. It's not every day that you have this kind of case during a pandemic. So what could we be looking at in the next several months if, in fact, he does take a plea deal and does admit his guilt?
Listen, Jesse, I think that is the right decision here. First of all, if he has a trial, there will be a circus. To your point, everybody wants to see this. And with COVID-19, it's going to be very hard to make sure that people have access and to make sure that there's transparency. But don't forget, Governor Gavin Newsom has said that the death penalty is on hold here. So the prosecution is probably thinking to themselves, why should we go for the death penalty? If he's going to accept a plea deal, let's spare everyone all of the drama and take the life sentence. So I think if we see that, it's the right decision in this case.
But Gigi, this isn't foolproof, right? I mean, what we're hearing is they're entering negotiations. Nothing has been confirmed as of yet. No deal has been finalized. How could this fall apart? And we know that Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., there are some interesting stories about him nonetheless in terms of the way he's been behaving during all of this. So the question is, could this fall apart? How secure is this idea of a plea deal?
Well, negotiations can fall apart at any time. You know, the state has an obligation to entertain an offer made by the defense. And in this situation, maybe the defense doesn't want to accept responsibility for all the charges. That would be a way this negotiation can fail. You know, the prosecution is going to expect that if the defense wants to take the death penalty off the table, they're going to have to accept full responsibility for all of the crimes that he's charged with. If he's not willing to do that, then I can see the state backing out from this negotiation.
Well, we're going to follow what happens with Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. And if in fact he does take a plea deal, that is going to be the end of quite a saga that has reached back all the way since the 70s. We want to switch gears right now and focus something that's in my hometown, New York City. You might have seen this. It's really disturbing. A 92-year-old woman is shown on video, and we're going to show it to you right now, where she is pushed by a random stranger into a fire hydrant. 92 years old. Now, what we can tell you is that a man has been arrested. The suspect is named Rayshard Brimage. He has been taken into custody. Geraldine, who is the woman there, she's actually recovering. She was taken to the hospital, and she is now back at home. And she conducted an interview with local, I believe, NBC, just talking about her feelings about what happened here. Take a look.
As for Geraldine, she says she'll soon find the courage to get back outside, and she hopes the man who hurt her gets jail time.
I'm so happy he was arrested. Boy, he's got to stay in jail and think about what he did, and try to change and try to make himself better.
92 years old. Now, Brimage, get this, two-time convicted sex offender, and he was arrested over 100 times. Terry, turning it over to you. I don't understand how this guy was walking the streets, literally walking the streets, because what did we learn? We learned that he had 3 recent arrests, and instead of being locked up, he was given these tickets, and he wasn't locked up. These tickets to appear, I guess? I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me?
Well, Jesse, in New York, you can get a desk appearance ticket, what they call a DAT, and you can get that to come back to court to get your charges spelled out to you. And you don't have to be jailed. But usually you get a desk appearance if you don't have a severe crime or if you don't have a long criminal history. Here we see that this individual has a huge criminal history. He's been charged multiple times. And the fact that he has this history and the severity of the crime, I definitely think that he should not have had any prior desk appearance tickets. And frankly, you know, I think they should throw the book at him. This was an innocent 92-year-old, I think you said, individual, couldn't defend herself. And it's just a brutal crime for no reason.
Yeah, Gigi, you got to explain this to me. This looks like a nightmare for a defense attorney. You have an older woman who's doing absolutely nothing, and she's pushed to the ground. It's all caught on tape. If you were representing him, what do? I mean, is this a case where we're just going to see a plea deal? Or what? I mean, really, what would a deal look like here? Otherwise, how would you defend it?
I would explore a mental health defense. I can't imagine anybody in their right mind wanting to commit this type of act against an innocent and vulnerable person, such as the victim in this case, a 92-year-old woman minding her own business, walking the street, getting shoved by some random assailant. It's absolutely awful. And there's absolutely no motivation that we can see from the video that would provoke an attack to the victim. So I would definitely be exploring mental health issues, seeing if there's some sort of way we can mitigate his attack to sum it up to something beyond his control. But otherwise, this is a pretty defenseless crime.
Terry, does this end with him, or does this now move on? Because there seems to be a failure here. I don't, again, understand how somebody was arrested 100 times and was let out. I mean, we're talking about reforms across the country. Does something have to change here based upon this case?
Yes, I think something does have to change here. And I think we are putting reforms in place here in New York. And there has been some talk after this, actually, the fact that the desk appearance really shouldn't be issued when you have these severe crimes. The crimes that he committed before, some were against 13-year-old girls, and they were sexually related. I believe he was on the registry for sex offenders, so he should have been in jail. And I think that they will keep him in jail, and I think that they will try to change the laws in the future so that someone like this who has this criminal history will not be on the street, and regardless of his mental health, will not be subjecting people to this type of assault.
You know, Gigi, I want to ask you a question here because in a climate where there's a lot of spotlights put on police, and we're going to get into that in a minute after the break, you have to wonder if it wasn't for the resources and manpower of a police force, would he still be out there? And I wonder if that's going to be expanded into a larger conversation when we talk about police reforms and the need for police. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about how we utilize our police force, because at the moment, police officers answer all sorts of calls. They're answering homelessness calls, they're answering bank robberies, they're answering domestic violence calls. What we should be seeking as far as reform is searching for specific task forces within the police force that handle specific types of issues, such as this one. You have someone who's has a bunch of mental health issues, possibly. Maybe he should be being policed in a different way than through the criminal justice system.
That's the question. The question is this shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have been out, and he shouldn't have been allowed to do this. So it does put a spotlight and forces people to answer some difficult questions. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we are going to talk about Rayshard Brooks and the charging of these officers. Stay tuned. All right, everybody, let's talk about what we addressed at the beginning of the program. Rayshard Brooks, Atlanta, the district attorney there announced that arrest warrants have been issued. We learned that Garrett Rolfe, who's the officer that gunned down Rayshard Brooks during this struggle outside of a Wendy's over a taser, he himself has been charged with 11 counts, including felony murder and aggravated assault. Devin Brosnan, his colleague, according to the DA, is apparently going to plead guilty and testify and be the state's star witness against Rolfe. But we learned that Don Samuel, who is representing Mr. Brosnan, says that's not the case. Let's just go back to the press conference where you heard DA Howard explaining why and how these charges came about.
Mr. Brooks was shot. There is an Atlanta policy that requires that the officers have to provide timely medical attention to Mr. Brooks or to anyone who is injured. But after Mr. Brooks was shot, for some period of 2 minutes and 12 seconds, there was no medical attention applied to Mr. Brooks. But when we examined the videotape and in our discussions with witnesses, what we discovered is during the 2 minutes and 12 seconds that Officer Rolfe actually kicked Mr. Brooks while he laid on the ground, while he was there fighting for his life. Secondly, from the videotape, we were able to see that the other officer, Officer Brosnan, actually stood on Mr. Brooks's shoulders while he was there struggling for his life. We were able to conclude that based on the way that these officers conducted themselves while Mr. Brooks was lying there, that the demeanor of the officers immediately after the shooting did not reflect any fear or danger of Mr. Brooks, but their actions really reflected other kinds of emotions.
So the big thing there from DA Howard is that Brooks did not pose an immediate danger. So that's interesting. I want to bring in my guests once again. I got with me Terry, I got with me Gigi, but I also have former prosecutor Melba Pearson, who's with us as well. Melba, it's great to have you back on the show. Let me start with you. Big revelations during this press conference where they said Rolfe kicked Brooks after the shooting. They didn't render medical aid. And talking about the justification here, what's your thoughts on the arrest warrants issued and the charges?
So thank you again, Jesse, for having me on this afternoon, and hello to my fellow panelists. I think the charges were definitely in order and appropriate. We're seeing this trend of not rendering aid, as we saw in the George Floyd case, where the gentleman George Floyd was literally gasping and dying and begging for his life, and the other officers restrained him so that the officer who had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck would be able to, basically to keep him in place for him to pass away. So we see the same sort of behavior here in Atlanta, where the man was shot. He's clearly dying. And you have a situation where one officer proceeds to kick him and the other proceeds to stand on his shoulders, again, seemingly to either hasten the death process, but certainly not trying to render aid. So this is conduct that's very unbecoming of police officers. This type of activity gives police officers a bad name. And I'm happy to see that DA Paul Howard, who I do know, and he has been in office for a number of years and is facing re-election, I am glad that he did stand up and make sure that charges were filed, because at the end of the day, the community needs to see this kind of accountability in order to have trust in the criminal justice system as well as in law enforcement.
So, Gigi, one of the things that came up during the press conference is this idea of when can an officer use deadly force. DA Howard cited two different cases, and the idea behind this was that you can only use deadly force if you're an officer if you're an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury, and you have to judge an officer's actions at that time. What would a reasonable officer have done? People look at this across the country and say you have somebody who grabbed a taser, fired the taser at the officer after fighting off the officers. How is that not an immediate threat of danger? Because a taser is dangerous, and who knows what could have happened to the officer if, in fact, he was incapacitated. What is the response to that argument?
Well, the response is to look at the scenario as a whole. First of all, the officers completed an investigation, conducted a search of Mr. Rayshard and his vehicle, and did not find any weapons on him. That already puts that point to moot that they were in reasonable fear of their lives. Second of all, a taser is not equivalent to a gun. A taser cannot inflict as much damage as a gun can. And the fact that Mr. Brooks was running away from the officer and was shot twice in the back does not mean that the officer was justified in shooting Mr. Brooks just because he had a taser that he stole from the officer during a scuffle.
So I'm glad you mentioned this. I want to go to the shooting itself. We're going to show you a few different angles here. One is from body cam footage from Officer Brosnan, and then the other one is dash cam footage from Officer Rolfe. It shows you two different angles, and then when we come out, I'm going to show you a third angle from the Wendy surveillance footage as well. So let's just take a look at those real quick.
I think you've had too much to drink to be driving. Put your hands behind your back for me. Here, put your hands behind your back. Hey, stop fighting! Stop fighting! Stop fighting! Stop fighting! You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased! Stop! Mr. Rolfe! Stop! Come on, man! Stop! You're gonna get tased! Mr. Rolfe! Hey, hands off the fucking taser! Hands off the taser! Stop fighting! Hands off the taser! Stop fighting! You got my fucking taser! Oh, 63.
All right, and again, here's another view. What you're going to see is from the Wendy's surveillance, a lot of the actual shooting. It's a clearer image here. Terry, as we watch this, two things I want to ask you. One, DA Howard said the officers didn't properly inform Brooks that he was arrested for driving under the influence. You heard that right there. Do you agree with what DA Howard said? And number two, it's one thing to charge the officers. Is it easy to win this case? So first, your thoughts on the DUI conversation, and two, could they win this case?
Well, I think that DA Howard was absolutely right. I think that they needed to have informed him under police policy that he was under arrest, and that could really go to the point of what's happening. You're putting my arms behind my back. I've already cooperated with you for 40 plus minutes. I've taken a breathalyzer. So why are you putting me in handcuffs? So I'm going to run away, because I think there are a lot of people. There are other cases, Ahmaud Arbery. We've had the cases where the police officers took people out of the car, slammed them down. They were just innocent protesters. So there's a lot happening. And I think Brooks is thinking to himself, I better get out of here. As to your question regarding whether or not there's going to be a conviction, yes, it's difficult, but I think the way that the prosecution is setting this up is the right way to do it. They've got 11 counts against Rolfe, and they've got several other counts, 3 counts, I think, against Brosnan, and I think they're doing it the right way. They have the lesser included charges, so I think we'll get a conviction. I think because we have the tape, that we might actually get a conviction on the felony murder charge as far as Rolfe is concerned, and the highest charge as far as the other police officers concerned. And Jesse, let me just end with saying this. I can't believe the fact that one had his foot or his, body on the shoulder of, now the deceased individual, and the other one, kicked him. It's a horrible situation.
Especially in a time when we're living post-George Floyd. I mean, don't understand that, and clearly we'll get more evidence and understanding of what happened here. Melba, you got to explain something to me. So we learned from this press conference that Brosnan's going to be the state's star witness to testify against Rolfe, his colleague. Wow, what huge news. He's going to plead guilty. Why then did we hear from Don Samuel, who's representing Brosnan, and said, my client's not going to plead guilty. He's not going to be the star witness. I mean, that didn't happen yet. What's happening here? Why is the DA saying one thing and this defense attorney saying another?
It sounds to me that the deal was not complete. I feel like there's probably some initial discussions to explore using this officer as a key witness in the case, and that maybe some offers were placed on the table, but clearly the defendant hasn't fully accepted it yet, and they haven't had a true meeting of the minds in order to move forward with this. And also, this may be a situation where maybe the officer was feeling some pressure, or maybe he was being intimidated by other officers, because we are all very familiar with that blue wall of silence. So it's always a tough road for officers to be able to testify against fellow officers when it comes to wrongdoing. So there may have been some pressure, whether it be from the union or other folks on the department along with him, for him not to go forward with taking a plea and testifying against the other officer. But we'll see, because, that's now. But again, as people stare down the barrel of a potential long sentence, depending on the maximums that are in place, he may be trying to save himself and may change his mind in a month or two or even a year from now. It all depends.
Yeah, look, it was a shock to hear that. Look, Gigi, we have about a minute left. What is going to happen next here, and what are you looking out for?
Well, there's definitely going to be an investigation into the situation. I don't see this being resolved anytime soon, because this is going to take a long time to figure out. I agree 100% with Ms. Melba Pearson's analysis. I think that right now it's too early to say that Rawson is going to or not going to cooperate. But as time passes, we'll be able to determine whether or not he will, and he will make a very strong witness for the prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, the key witness, although there are multiple witnesses that DA Howard said they interviewed, there's multiple tapes here. They looked at ballistics. They spoke to a taser expert. They looked at the tasers. Clearly, they felt they had enough information to charge. But interesting to note, these are arrest warrants issued before an indictment. So that's probably the next thing we'll see. Let's take a break. When we come back, a huge development in the Brianna Taylor case, as well as George Floyd. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. Let's talk about Brianna Taylor. She's the Louisville EMT who was gunned down in her own apartment during a police raid. As you recall, the officers had a no-knock warrant, very controversial there, believing that it was a site of drug operations, even though it wasn't. Nothing illegal was going on. And she was killed. So the question becomes, well, what happened here? The attorneys for the family of Brianna Taylor, they are claiming that the mayor, Greg Fisher, and the police department are deliberately covering up the details of what happened because the family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and there's been multiple subpoenas that have been filed trying to get these documents, trying to understand what happened, and yet they haven't received what they're asking for. I'm going to get into that in a second. Just to give you a flavor of what this case is about, let's go into a discussion of Brianna's law, which is, going to ban no-knock warrants in the state. So you hear more about this. Listen to this conversation, and then we're going to get into this huge revelation from the attorneys of Brianna Taylor's family.
I'm just going to say, Brianna, that's all she wanted to do was save lives. So with this law, she'll get to continue to do that. So we're grateful for that. She would be so, she would be so happy.
So I just want to read you a little bit of what the lawyers said in filings, and they are actually trying to hold the custodians of this information from the coroner's office and the police department in contempt of court. They say, under the direction and instruction of our mayor, none of these documents were produced and have not been produced. Instead, under the direction of the mayor, the coroner's office, and the merit board produced the information directly to counsel for the city and withheld it from our office and Tamika. Terry, I want to start with you. This is huge accusation right here. What did you make of it?
Listen, I hope they can back that up. Anytime you have a civil wrongful death action, you move for discovery and you want documents. And if those documents exist, then they should be produced, and they should be produced to both sides. So if in fact we have withholding of evidence here, I think that the attorneys have a very good case. And you're going to look at what were the requests, when were they made, how were they made, and if in fact the documents have been produced to the other side. So it's a huge accusation, and if it's true, there could be some penalties imposed by the court against the other side.
Gigi, any justification here in what the city's doing? Look, I understand things need time, there's confidentiality issues, but you're talking about months since this shooting. There's a lawsuit filed. How are they going to respond to this? How should they respond to this?
They're going to have a tough defense here. There's been subpoenas issues. They've gave an excuse the first time they ignored the subpoenas and said, oh, sorry, we just got lost in a scuffle. The attorneys gave them a new deadline and asked for these documents to be produced forthwith, and they ignored those requests. I mean, over and over, the city has gone above and beyond to keep important information from Brianna Taylor's family, from the autopsy to multiple open records requests. It's quite frankly undefensible as far as the city of Louisville is concerned, and the mayor may face contempt for ignoring these requests.
Melba, real quick, what could be what is the cover up here? What do they not want anyone to see, if you believe the attorneys here?
I believe the attorneys, and this is going to be a massive cover-up. This is a settlement or a judgment that may end up bankrupting the city of Louisville, because the level of negligence from the fact that the officers executed this no-knock warrant on the wrong house. They were 10 miles away from the target house. And secondly, the people they were looking for were already in custody. So there is nothing good in this case when it comes to the police department or the city of Louisville. So end of the day, they're trying to duck and cover and do whatever they can do, because they know that this is going to hurt, and hurt big when it comes to the pocketbook. They are going to have liability.
And I just wonder, and I just wonder if there's not a bigger conversation about Brianna Taylor. I don't hear about this case as much as maybe we should in the news, but clearly the case that everyone is talking about is George Floyd and what's going to happen next. And there's always information that comes out. Again, George Floyd, Minneapolis man who died after this controversial arrest, when these officers pinned him down. In particular, Derek Chauvin held his knee on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Now, I talk about new information coming to light. This is something, I don't know if you heard. There was a dispatcher on the day of this man's death that saw what was going on surveillance footage, reported to the supervisor. Listen very carefully to what the dispatcher says.
Hey, this is Jenna with Channel 1. Hey, what's up? Hey, so just wanted to let you know about the person with a knife at 2602 Bloomington. And then, I didn't know, you can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for 320's call. Oh, did they already put him in the, they must have already started moving him. And 320 over at Cup Foods.
Okay.
I don't know if they had used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed you or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
Yeah, they haven't said anything. This was just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
okay.
I'll find out.
No problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks a little different. All right, thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Good, bye.
So, Melba, I want to start with you because we were actually talking about this in the break. The thing that struck me, and it was the line that you struck, yeah, I don't want to see, you can call me a snitch. What does that tell you about the culture and the climate?
Basically, whatever the perception is, if you're intervening in another officer's call, or if you are basically raising awareness around an action that may be inappropriate, there's that perception that you're being a snitch and you're not standing with your fellow officers. And clearly, this was a situation that, you know, from the bystanders who were there screaming at the officers to stop, you know, to the dispatcher who obviously is seeing issues and being like, wait a minute, why are 4 officers or 3 officers sitting on a man and he doesn't seem to be fighting? So she's seeing the same thing that we all are seeing. And, you know, she's trying to temper probably her outrage, even though she sounded very casual in that call. I think she was just trying to temper, like, am I seeing what I really think I'm seeing? Because this looks wrong. And so she wanted to flag it to at least, you know, bring it to someone's attention. So now she, of course, will escape liability because she flagged it, as opposed to the other folks, as we saw, the other officers or ex-officers, you know, that basically participated and tried to help cover this up and abuse George Floyd and eventually murder him. So yeah, the "you can call me a snitch if you want to" line tells you depths about the issues going on in the Minneapolis Police Department, which is probably what's led to its disbanding, because of the fact that all of these different techniques and, you know, de-escalation training and all of this was implemented, and you're still having the same outcomes.
And there were other 911 transcripts released where people around thought the same thing, something was wrong. And Terry, let me get to you on this point, because if you keep hearing more and more of this where everybody thought something was wrong, we're lawyers, we talk about the reasonable person test. If this goes to trial against Derek Chauvin and he doesn't take a plea deal, isn't it going to be really hard for him to assert that, well, a reasonable officer in my position would have done the same thing?
Well, I think it's going to be extremely difficult, Jesse, and beyond what everyone else is saying, whether it's other police officers or whether it's the stand buyers who are standing there watching all of this. We have the video, and you see Chauvin right there.
Yep.
He has his hands in his pocket, and he acts like he just doesn't care. This was not reasonable. This was, I believe it was intentional, frankly.
It is an image or images that will be in a lot of people's minds, probably for the rest of their life. But we are going to continue to break down what happens in this case and all the cases that we covered today. I want to thank all my guests, Terry, Melba, Gigi. Thank you so much for breaking it all down with me. Everyone out there, thanks for joining us, and please stay safe. We will be back in 2 days. See you then.